Late November, 1838, the Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. The world had been reduced to two things, the grey-white of the sky and the screaming sound of the wind. It was a wind that didn't blow around things. It blew through them. It found the gap in a wool mitten, the seam in a buffalo hide coat, and the microscopic cracks in a man's resolve. Ice crystals, driven horizontal, didn't fall but attacked, stinging any exposed skin like hornets. Below, the snow was not a soft blanket, but a hard, scoured desert of drifts and frozen sastrugi. The silence of the high peaks was gone, replaced by a deafening, abrasive roar that seemed to come from inside the skull. This was the onset of a full-blown whiteout, and in the midst of it, Silas Vane was failing to make a fire. He swung his axe again, the steel head biting into a frozen pine log with a dull, unsatisfying thunk. The sound was stolen by the wind instantly. Silas Vane, a man in his late 30s, was no greenhorn. He had been trapping beaver in these mountains for a decade, long enough to see the trade begin its slow, sad collapse. He was lean, tough as cured leather, his beard and eyebrows already caked in ice. He had chosen this spot hours ago, a shallow depression partially protected by a stand of gnarled pines. Following the common wisdom, he had cleared the snow down to the frozen earth and built a ring of stones. Now he was feeding his precious, hard-won fuel into it. The fire was a betrayal. The flames, whipped sideways by the gusts, consumed the dry pine branches with a desperate, greedy hunger, but they gave back almost no heat. The smoke, thick and resinous, didn't rise. It was beaten flat, choking him, forcing him to turn his back to the very warmth he was trying to create. His heavy copper kettle, suspended over the blaze from a makeshift tripod, was barely lukewarm. The water he'd melted was already forming a new ring of ice around its inner edge. He crouched, holding his hands, already numb inside his mittens, toward the frantic blaze. The flames licked at him, but the wind snatched the heat and flung it out into the vast, indifferent cold. He could feel the temperature dropping, the air becoming denser, heavier. He was burning calories at an alarming rate, calories he could not afford to lose. The physical effort of gathering the wood, of fighting the wind, had already cost him. Now, the fire itself was costing him, demanding more and more fuel for less and less effect. This was how men died, not in a sudden catastrophe, but in a slow, cumulative failure of their most basic systems. They froze to death just feet from a fire, their pockets full of tinder and their axe in their hand. Silas looked at the roaring, useless blaze and felt a cold spike of desperation, followed by a deeper, more profound frustration. He was doing this just as he had been taught. He was doing this just like everyone else, and in this wind, the right way was a cold, efficient lie. This standard fire was not a tool of survival. It was a funeral pyre in the making. He looked at the deep snow around him, an obstacle. He looked at the hard, frozen earth, an enemy. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that he had to unlearn everything he thought he knew about fire, and he had to do it before the last light left the sky. The fire Silas Vane had built was the fire of the rendezvous, the fire of the plains, the fire of a calm night in the forested lowlands. When he'd first come west, joining the brigades out of St. Louis, a big fire was a sign of prowess. It was a column of smoke that signaled location, a roaring heart of the camp where men shared stories, roasted bison ribs, and dried their plues. It was a social beacon, an act of community. Technically it was simple, a wide, shallow pit, or often just a ring of stones laid directly on the ground. It was designed to be seen, to be felt from all sides. It was an offensive weapon against the dark, built on the assumption of abundant, dry hardwood and calm air. A proper trapper's fire was expected to consume a massive deadfall pine or a half-cord of aspen in a single night, radiating a crude, overwhelming heat that pushed back the wilderness. But the wilderness of the high peaks in winter was not a gentle darkness. It was an active, malevolent force, and that fire, the standard fire, had a fatal, fundamental flaw. It was completely naked to the wind. Silas remembered the hard lesson from 2 winters past, in the Uinta range. He and another trapper, a young, optimistic man from Tennessee named Jebediah Cole, had been caught by a sudden norther. They had made camp in a sparse aspen grove. Following the accepted method, they had spent hours gathering a huge pile of wood. They built a massive blaze, a fire so large it cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the trees 50 yards distant, and they had frozen all night long. The wind, instead of being blocked, had been drawn to the fire, feeding it, sucking the cold air in from all sides, and then whipping the heat and smoke into a chaotic vortex. To get any warmth, they had to huddle so close that the toes of their moccasins were scorched and their wool blankets smoked. Yet, the entire time, their backs, exposed to the wind now amplified by the fire's own draft, were stiff with frost. Jebediah had coughed relentlessly, his lungs burned by the acrid smoke, and by morning 3 toes on his left foot were the color of waxy white tallow. They were sitting less than 10 feet from a fire that was consuming an entire tree, and they were freezing to death. Silas had never forgotten the quiet, horrible realization of that night. The fire wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. It created its own blizzard, consuming their fuel and their strength and giving almost nothing in return. It was a glutton. Since then, Silas had seen the same flaw everywhere. He saw it in the way the wind would shift, suddenly enveloping a camp in blinding smoke. He saw it in the immense blackened scars on the forest floor, where a fire had demanded a vast sacrifice of wood for a few hours of dubious comfort. It was a design built for a world without wind, a world of infinite fuel. It was an arrogant fire, a fire that tried to defeat the cold by brute force. But here, in the Wind River Range, brute force was a joke. The wind was stronger. The cold was deeper. He looked again at his current pathetic blaze. The wind was stealing its heat. It was a thief, and he had built a fire with no walls, no locks, and no defense. He needed a fire that hid. He needed a fire that concentrated. He needed a fire that was a stove, not a bonfire, and he needed a way to stop the wind from being a thief, and instead to make it a servant. The seeds of the solution had been planted in his mind over years, in small, almost unnoticed observations. They came not from the loud boasts of the brigade leaders, but from the quiet actions of those who had truly made peace with the high lonesome. 2 summers ago, while scouting for sign in the high basins, he had observed a small Shoshone family camp. He had watched from a ridge, unseen. They were not fighting the elements. Their small, hide-covered lodge was tucked into the absolute lee of a massive rockfall, a place he would have dismissed as cramped and dark. Their fire, built in the afternoon, was not a fire at all by his standards. It was a tiny, smokeless handful of flames, barely visible, yet the women were cooking and the men were working on hides. all clustered around it, their faces illuminated, their hands moving deftly. They were comfortable. His own camp, a quarter-mile away, was set in a good spot, an open meadow, and his own larger fire was already being scattered by the afternoon breeze, forcing him to constantly shift his position. He realized their fire wasn't built for show. It was built to function. It was small, it was protected, and it was working. The second seed was a conversation at the Green River Rendezvous the previous July. The summer gathering was a chaos of whiskey, trade, and tall tales. But in a quiet corner, Silas had found Elias, Old Man Hemlock, a trapper who had been in the mountains since before the War of 1812. Hemlock was widely regarded as an eccentric, a man who preferred the company of the wind to that of men. Silas, frustrated by the memory of his night with Jebediah Cole, had complained about the wind's thievery. Hemlock hadn't even looked up from mending his moccasins. He just grunted. "That's 'cause you're building a fool's fire, boy." Silas had bristled. "It's the same fire everyone builds." Hemlock finally paused, his needle halfway through the leather. "Aye, and everyone's a fool in a norther. You're building a bonfire to warm the eagles. You're not building a stove to warm your hands." He used his awl to draw in the dirt. Fire wants to go up. Heat wants to go sideways. Wind wants to go through. You're letting them all do what they please, and what they please is to leave you to freeze. Eddie, Hemlock's finger traced a line in the dust. "First, you dig. Get the fire out of the main wind. But don't just dig a hole. Dig a trench. Make the wind blow into it, not across it. Make the wind your bellows, not your enemy. It'll feed the flame, make it burn twice as hot on half the wood." Then he drew a second line, perpendicular to the first. "Second, stop trying to warm the whole damn territory. You ain't God. Heat needs a backstop, something to hit and bounce right back onto your face. You build a wall, a flat rock, a stack of green, sappy logs that won't burn. You put it behind the fire. The fire burns, the heat hits the wall gets hot, and the wall throws that heat right back at you. You build a stove, boy, not a bonfire." He had spat and returned to his sewing. The conversation had stuck with Silas. Dig a trench, use the wind as a bellows, build a backstop, a stove, not a fire. And as he observed the land, he saw it everywhere. He saw how the sun hit a south-facing cliff, and how that rock radiated warmth long after sunset, thermal mass. He saw how snow built up, leaving a deep, protected drift in the lee of a boulder, a natural shelter, the Shoshone Old Man Hemlock, the land itself. They were all saying the same thing. Now, in the whiteout of 1838, with his standard fire dying and the real cold beginning to bite into his bones, the memories coalesced into a desperate, focused plan. He was shivering, not just from cold, but from the sudden, terrifying clarity of his situation. He had wasted an hour. He might only have another hour of functional dexterity left in his hands. He kicked snow onto the pathetic smoking pile of sticks, extinguishing it. He rescued the largest embers, sheltering them in his tinderbox, which he tucked inside his coat. He stood up, pulling his hat down, and scanned the roaring white landscape. He needed 3 things: a windbreak for his body, a trench for the fire, and a wall for the heat. His eyes fell on a granite boulder about 6 feet high, with a long, deep snowdrift packed against its lee side. This was it. The boulder would be his back. The snowdrift would be his protection. He began to work, not with the frantic energy of panic, but with a cold, methodical desperation. His axe was his primary tool. First, he used its flat back and his own boots to pack and carve the snow. He didn't just dig a hole. He excavated a U-shaped space, about 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, with the granite boulder forming the solid back of the U. The walls of snow he'd dug out were piled up and packed hard, raising the height of the protective barrier to nearly 5 feet. The wind screamed over the top, but inside this new alcove, the air was almost miraculously still. He had built a fortress against the primary assault, the convective heat loss from the wind itself. This took him 20 minutes, and he was sweating despite the cold. Next, the fire. He moved to the center of his new shelter. With his axe, he began to chop into the hard-packed snow and the frozen earth beneath it. He didn't dig a pit. He dug a trench, just as Hemlock had described. It was about 3 feet long, a foot wide, and nearly 2 feet deep. Critically, he oriented the long axis of the trench with the prevailing wind that was now flowing over his snow wall, creating a slight controlled draft into his alcove. The upwind end of the trench was the bellows, the air intake. The downwind end would be the firebox. Now, the final crucial component. He gathered several flat, heavy stones, half buried in the snow, and used them to line the far end and sides of the firebox. At the downwind terminus of the trench, just behind this stone-lined box, he used his axe to drive 2 thick, sharpened stakes into the frozen ground. Against these, he stacked a dense wall of green, sappy pine logs he'd cut earlier. This was the backstop. This was the reflector. The entire system was now laid out. His shelter, the snow-walled alcove backed by the boulder, faced the reflector wall. In between them lay the fire trench. He was no longer building a fire. He was building an engine. The construction had cost him precious warmth. His fingers were stiff, his movements clumsy. The margin for error was gone. He knelt in his snow-walled shelter, the wind a dull roar overhead. He opened his tinderbox. The embers he'd saved were faint, cherry-red specks in the grey char-cloth. He gently placed them at the bottom of the fire trench, in the stone-lined firebox, and laid the tiniest, driest shavings of pine resin and bark over them. He shielded the fragile spark with his body and blew, not hard, but steadily. The wind, channeled by the snow walls, swirled gently into the alcove and found the opening of the trench. It was no longer a thief, it was a bellows. The draft moved down the channel, hit the tinder, and the spark exploded into a clean, yellow flame. The wind, now harnessed, was feeding the fire, not scattering it. Silas added larger kindling, then small split sticks. The fire didn't spread out. It grew up and forward, contained by the trench, focused into a tight, intense jet of heat. The flames, instead of being whipped into chaos, ran the length of the trench and slammed directly into the green log reflector wall. The sappy wood began to hiss and steam almost immediately, the surface darkening, but it would not burn. It was absorbing. The full, concentrated fury of the fire. Silas scrambled back and settled himself against the granite boulder, his oiled canvas tarp pulled over him as a rudimentary roof. He was 5 feet away from the fire, but he could already feel it. It was unlike any campfire he had ever experienced. It was not a diffuse, smoky warmth. It was a focused, directional, radiant heat. The green log wall, now steaming, was becoming a radiator, a massive, hot surface that was projecting the heat at him. He held up his hands. The palms were stinging with warmth. He could feel it on his face, his chest, his thighs. It was as if he were sitting in front of an open-door iron stove. He looked at the fire itself. It was small, contained, efficient. He was using wood no thicker than his wrist, but the heat output was triple that of his previous, larger fire. The boulder at his back, protected from the wind, was also slowly absorbing his own body heat and reflecting it back at him. He was encased in a bubble of thermal efficiency. He reached for his copper kettle, the water inside now frozen solid. He didn't hang it over the fire. That would be inefficient. He placed it on the flat stones at the edge of the firebox, right in front of the reflector wall. The combined heat from the fire and the reflected energy from the wall enveloped it. Within 5 minutes, the ice cracked. Within 10, steam was rising. Within 15, the kettle was singing with a rolling, furious boil. He was cooking. He was making hot water in the middle of a sub-zero whiteout, using a fraction of the fuel. He unthawed a strip of frozen bison jerky, laying it on the hot stones to sizzle. He was not just surviving, he was living. The blizzard raged for 2 solid days. The wind never ceased its assault, piling snow against his U-shaped walls until his shelter was almost a complete cave. But inside, Silas Vane was warm. He was dry. He fed his small, efficient trench fire with twigs and branches he could gather without straying more than a few yards from his alcove. The reflecting trench, as he came to call it in his own mind, performed perfectly. The green log wall became a blackened, glowing mass of thermal energy, radiating constant, steady heat. The boulder at his back did the same. He slept. He drank hot willow bark tea. He ate his sizzling jerky. The system, this engine of survival, had transformed a lethal environment into a livable one. When the storm finally broke, he emerged into a brilliant, sun-scoured world, rested and strong. The memory of Jebediah Cole's frozen feet was still sharp, but it was now overlaid with a new, profound sense of a code that had been cracked. That summer, at the 1839 rendezvous on Horse Creek, the mood was sour. The beaver was trapped out. The prices were falling, and the talk was of leaving the mountains. Men griped about the previous winter, the blue norther that had caught so many. A new man, a greenhorn from Missouri, had been found frozen solid, his arms wrapped around a circle of burnt-out logs, his axe right beside him. Silas listened quietly. Then he took a stick and drew in the dirt. He drew the snow wall, the boulder, the trench aligned with the wind. He drew the firebox and, most importantly, the reflector wall. "You're all building bonfires," he said, echoing Old Man Hemlock. "You're warm in the sky. You should be warm in your wall." Some of the men scoffed. "A fire in a hole? That's an Indian trick. Green logs? They'll just put the fire out." But a few of the older, smarter trappers, men who had also spent nights shivering while feeding a hungry, wasteful blaze, knelt and looked closer. They asked questions. How deep the trench? How close the wall? You aim it at the wind. Silas explained the principles. It wasn't the fire that warmed you. It was the reflector. The fire's only job was to heat the reflector. The trench's only job was to make the fire burn hot and fast with minimal wood. The wind was the engine. By the end of the rendezvous, at least 4 other trapping parties had memorized the design. That winter they tried it, and it worked. The Silas Trench, sometimes called the Trapper's Stove, began to spread. It was a piece of mountain man vernacular, a technique passed from one man to another, sketched in the dirt, adapted for different terrains. Years later, emigrants on the Oregon Trail would be taught a variation by their guides. using a stacked sod wall as a reflector to bake bread. Soldiers in the high plains forts used the same principle for winter picket duty, digging trenches in the frozen prairie. The legacy was not his name, which was quickly forgotten, but the method, a method that saved fuel, saved hands and feet, and saved lives. The genius of the reflecting trench was not magic. It was a masterful, intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. Silas Vane, with no formal education, had solved three distinct problems in physics simultaneously. First, he defeated convective heat loss. A standard fire loses the majority of its heat to convection. The hot air simply rises and is blown away. By sinking the fire into a trench and protecting his camp with snow walls, Silas stopped the wind from stealing the heat he was creating. The wind could no longer rob his body or the fire itself. Second, he optimized combustion. The trench, precisely aligned with the prevailing wind, acted as a high-velocity bellows. This forced air system provided a constant, concentrated stream of oxygen directly to the fuel's base, resulting in a much hotter, more complete combustion. He was getting more BTUs out of every single stick. This is why his fire burned so intensely hot while consuming so little fuel. The difference between a smoky, inefficient smolder and a clean, jet-like flame. But the third and most brilliant principle was the control of radiant heat. Heat in a fire is transferred as infrared radiation, the energy you feel on your skin. In a standard fire, this radiation shoots off in all 360 degrees, warming the empty air, the trees, and the sky. It is catastrophically wasteful. The green log and stone backstop was the solution. It acted as a thermal mirror. The radiant heat from the fire jet traveled the short distance to the wall, was absorbed, and then was re-radiated back in a single focused direction at Silas. This, combined with the thermal mass of the granite boulder at his back, which trapped and reflected his own body heat, created what modern engineers would call a passive radiant heating system. He had built a high-efficiency, forced-air, passive solar, or fire-solar, survival shelter. He had understood, on a primal level, that survival in the cold is not about the production of heat. It is about the management and concentration of it. He wasn't just fighting the cold, he was building a microclimate, harnessing the very wind that sought to kill him and turning it into his servant. It was a design born of observation, desperation, and a profound respect for the unchangeable laws of the wilderness. Silas Vane outlived the beaver trade, a ghost from an era that vanished almost overnight. He eventually took his plews, his axe, and his old copper kettle down from the high peaks. He journeyed west, finally settling in the damp, mild green of the Oregon Valley, a world away from the searing cold and wind of the high plains. He built a farmhouse, and those who saw it noted his chimney was peculiar. He'd built the firebox shallow, with angled sides, a design men would later call a Rumford, built not to hold logs, but to radiate heat, to throw the warmth into the room instead of letting it escape up the flue. He had recognized the same principle, translated from a log wall in a blizzard to a brick hearth in a home. He lived a long life, became a farmer, and was known as a quiet man, one who always seemed to be watching the wind, even on the calmest of days. His battered copper kettle, blackened by 1,000 trench fires, sat on his hearthstone. To his grandchildren it was just a relic, a curious old pot. To Silas it was a reminder. It was the physical proof that a man could have boiling water in a whiteout, that he could be warm when the world screamed for his death. It was the symbol of an idea. He had learned the fundamental lesson of the frontier, a lesson that had nothing to do with courage or strength, and everything to do with humility and design. He learned that the wilderness does not reward brute force. It rewards efficiency. It does not care about your effort. It cares about your intelligence. We are all, in some way, facing a wind that wants to steal our warmth. Our first instinct is to build a bigger fire, to fight back with more energy, more noise, more fuel. But comfort and often survival rarely come from the size of the flame. They come from the wisdom of the design. They come from understanding the unseen forces around us and building a system that respects them. The great challenge is not to conquer the storm, but to build a simple wall that stops the heat from escaping and reflects it back, turning a cold void into a place of warmth.